Christ is in our midst. He is and shall always be. Welcome to another episode of the New Pascha, a video podcast ministry of the Western American Diocese of the Serbian Orthodox Church. My name is Father Bratso Krsic. I'm a parish priest at St. George Serbian Orthodox Church in San Diego, California. Our reflection on living our Orthodox faith in the context of real life, joy, challenges, and opportunities for spiritual growth continues. We pray that our conversation today, based on a living experience of Orthodox theology, serves as a guiding post, that it nourishes and heals our souls, leading us to encounter the risen Lord. Today, we are honored to have two sincere, caring, and knowledgeable Orthodox educators. Our first guest is Deacon David Williams, a postgraduate researcher in the Department of History at Royal Holloway University of London, where he is exploring a shared sacred spaces in the Byzantine Mediterranean. Since 2016, he has taught as assistant professor of history at the University of St. Catherine in San Diego, California. He has served the Serbian Orthodox Diocese of Western America as a deacon since 2014. A Byzantinist by training, Deacon David is especially interested in the reconstruction of the sacred in the various religious traditions of the Mediterranean. Deacon David and his wife Lauren have 4 children: Zoe, Theodore, Penelope, and Clementine, and live in North County, San Diego. Welcome, Deacon David.
Thank you very
And
much.
Professor. And Professor, we are happy that you're here.
Thank you.
Yes.
Me too.
Our second guest is Dr. Gaelan Gilbert, or Reader Anthony, is a visiting professor of arts and humanities at the University of St. Catherine, a regionally accredited Orthodox Christian institution of higher education in Southern California. He earned his doctorate in English literature with a focus on medieval literature, religion, and culture at the University of Victoria in British Columbia in 2015. From 2018 to 2020, he served as a headmaster of an Orthodox classical school, Christ the Savior Academy in Wichita, Kansas. He has extensive experience in teaching, research, curriculum design, and program development. He and his wife have designed and led study abroad programs across Europe, especially Greece. He enjoys sailing, cycling, backpacking, and taking any opportunity to explore nature with his family. In addition to academic scholarship, he has published a collection of poetry entitled One is Found First with Darkly Bright Press, as well as children's picture book entitled Laurel and the Wind with Ancient Faith Publishing. Welcome, Dr. Gilbert.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yes, we are blessed to have you on our today's program. And since we are doing this ministry within the context of the church, we'll be addressing you as Reader Anthony. So welcome once again. So coincidentally, both of you are professors at St. Catherine's University. And for some of our viewers and listeners, this might be a new information. There is Orthodox University here in Southern California. So please tell us about it. Deacon David, would you start first?
Yeah, certainly. Reader Anthony, I think, was there from the very beginning. I was brought in by him, in fact, as faculty in 2016. And it's a liberal arts university, and it's rooted in the Orthodox Christian tradition. And I think that it would really be best to ask him about the integration of classical classical learning, the trivium and quadrivium, because he was so instrumental actually in that process, right? And designed many of the courses that I now teach myself on a semester, per semester.
Yes, fantastic. Reader Anthony.
Well, I'm sure you've made many of those courses better, Deacon, but in any case, I wasn't at the university since the very beginning. I came in the third year. There were some faculty who started a couple years earlier. And the idea of St. Catherine College at that point, now University of St. Catherine, was to provide, basically three components of education in one degree. The first would be what's typically known as general education, a broad array of different subjects, from math and writing and science and foreign language, a little bit of economics and social science. And then the second component would be the something that was unique to St. Catherine, which was called the Integrated Core. And this was a set of 7 courses which students took. They took one integrated core course each semester as they traveled throughout their 4-year degree. And at the end of that, in their final semester, they wrote a senior thesis. But these courses, rather than going broadly, they went deep, very deep into primary sources and texts that were foundational for Western civilization. Things that, because it was an Orthodox college, also included an emphasis on the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, as well as Western Europe. So it was a nice added emphasis that we were able to give, which is normally left out in sort of classical core curricula.
Yes.
And then the third component was the specialized courses for the degree that the student was majoring in. And that could be in the arts and humanities, it could be in business, kinesiology, or remind me what the fourth one is, Deacon.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I've lost track.
Yeah,
yes, but there's so much.
Majors. Yes, and so there's new majors that have started. There's a psychology minor there now.
Yeah.
So there's new programs all the time. But yeah, that's the snapshot of the curriculum, and of course it's started as a very small institution where the students could get to know each other and form friendships, and then have opportunities to participate in extracurricular things like athletics or internships. And the school has really grown in terms of its enrollment quite a lot in the last few years. So it's an exciting time.
Yes, it has. And let me just share this with you. In 2011, I was asked by Dr. Frank Papatiofanis to come and attend one of the first meetings of the college at that time, St. Catherine's College. And I was there with late Father John Brown of blessed memory now. He was priest at St. Anthony, Antiochian Orthodox Parish. And Dr. Frank Papatiofanis was there, Dr. Tibbs, and perhaps 4 or 5 other faculty and staff members, and about 11 students, I believe, at that time that they had. And that was our first meeting. What a beginning. And so just in 9 years, the accreditation process and everything that has taken place is quite amazing. Quite amazing to see. And I'm so happy to see Orthodox, higher Orthodox education institution, not only in America, but here in our own backyard, if you will, in San Diego. It's quite amazing. And I'm so happy that 2 of you are professors there. Can you tell us a little bit more about perhaps student life? I attended a few sessions as a chaplain there, and I know there is a chapel, so students attend the chapel hour. We read hours, and there's a brief reflection that the chaplain offers to students, in addition to, of course, spending some time with them and providing counsel as Orthodox priest. And to me, that is so wonderful to see. So this complete integration and education of our young people to just to have that is incredible, and I think is much needed. And I hope that we Orthodox Christians in America take education to another level, that we have more higher education institutions, and that we follow this path. Because we have much to offer to our young people and to society, American society. Deacon David, do you have anything else to add to perhaps your experience as a deacon and professor at St. Catherine's College?
Yes, well, certainly. I'm very blessed to be able to work in it's such a unique environment. It's the only university that I have ever taught at, so I don't have much to compare it to, other than, of course, my own experiences in grad school. And I would say that working in that environment that takes care actively thinks about and develops not only a curriculum, but a sort of living praxis that has the student's soul in mind, is something that is incredibly special. And I feel a huge amount of responsibility because, of course, not all of our students are Orthodox. And certainly as the university grows, and now we're adding graduate programs as well, that will continue to be the case, certainly. We reflect in many ways the reality of Orthodoxy in America, although we do have a higher percentage of Orthodox students in the university than the United States has per capita.
Excellent. Earlier, I mentioned that I attended one of the first meetings at St. Catherine's College in 2011, and here I'm holding a mug that I actually received at that time. St. Catherine's College. It says college here, but it is university now. So, cheers to that.
Yes.
Yes, that is fantastic. Just moving along with our program, Dr. Gilbert or Reader Anthony, looking at your quite extensive curriculum vitae here, CV, I see that one of the presentations that you made in 2011 is titled A New Middle Ages, Nicholas Berdyaev's Prophetic Imagination for Pilgrims and Pioneers, the Growth of Orthodox Christianity in the 20th Century America, given at Florovsky Society History Symposium at Princeton Theological Seminary. This reflection on growth of Orthodox Christianity in the 20th century, some of the things that you have written, I haven't read the presentation, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to do research, but would you share with us your thoughts if there is anything applicable from that reflection to today's society, living in the 21st century now, 2020 as it is. So would you share some thoughts with us, please?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the question, Father. You know, that presentation tries to connect a couple different ways of thinking. One is that coming from Nicholas Berdyaev himself, who was a Russian Orthodox philosopher in the 20th century. He was one of the emigre thinkers who went to Paris and was associated with the St. Sergius Institute there, and was a very energetic scholar and wrote many books. And one of his books was titled, in fact, it had two titles. One title was The End of Our Time, but the second title, which came replace it, I believe, was A New Middle Ages. And so the title of my presentation was looking primarily at this work of his, but what it was trying to do was put it in the context of something called New Medievalism, which is a school of international relations theory that looks at the global sort of landscape in the late 20th and early 21st century, and sees in many cases a breakdown of national sovereignty, and in fact, an increase of something that's called complex space. So you have overlapping authorities, as different institutions at different scales have claims, let's say, on the certain rights of their citizens. So you have the individual, you have certain social institutions, you have the municipal government, the state government, and then you have these new sort of non-governmental actors like transnational corporations, or, in a very different way, the church itself, right, which is a transnational or a global Catholic organization, which has a certain authority, of course, right, over the lives of its members. And so I was trying to kind of put these in conversation. This sort of international relations idea of the 21st century and later being nations, in a sense, their sovereignty or their power that they would have had in the earlier 20th century or the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And Berdyaev's book is really a thought experiment of sorts, and he's imagining a future in which our social landscape looks very different, or I should say maybe our political landscape looks very different. He's trying to almost write a, not quite utopian, but an imaginative book that is trying to re-envision the place for the church in society. How can the church foster, creativity? How can the church foster more equitable, businesses, or how can the church help reform, the political world and these sorts of things? And so that's a brief summary.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting topics. And actually, I could come up with quite a few questions to continue our discussion. But I would like you to think about next question here. And let's see, looking here, I saw that you have written something about St. Nikolai of Zhicha. It is one of the articles here, Natural Beauty and Rhetorical Apophasis, St. Nikolai of Zhicha's Prayers by the Lake. That sounds very interesting, and I think our viewers, listeners, would like to hear that. So if you can think about that. In the meantime, let us go back to Deacon David, and I'd like to hear from you, Deacon, about shared sacred space. What is sacred space, and what does it mean to share the sacred space? Are we talking about the church, the temple, or is our shared space even our own bodies? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, very good questions. There are a couple of different ways to think about sacred space, and probably the one that's easiest for us in the Orthodox tradition is to think of the church, or to think of shrines or monasteries or places with particular significance, because we associate them with particular events in the life of Christ or our saints. In the last century, there was a very interesting Romanian historian of religions called Mircea Eliade, and he looked at, from an anthropological perspective, the need in all human societies to center our communities around sacra. And they could be sacred objects, but very often there was a spatial element that would center, say, for example, a town. The temple would be in the center, or a place where rites of passage or other significant events took place, and people would arrange their town planning around that center. And we do that in our own Western cultures as well. But the sacred space, from the Orthodox perspective, is really a place that is forever changed because of a manifestation of divinity. Now, when we think about, for example, Moses on Mount Sinai, or the transfiguration of Christ, or the resurrection, or the birth of our Lord God and Savior, we think about those geographies as becoming something other. An ontological change has occurred at those spaces, which marks them off from mundane and, importantly, profane space. And profane space, if we think about this in a binary term, which we probably shouldn't, but we tend to, we split space into sacred on the one hand and profane on the other. Now, in terms of shared space, that can be, it could be a sacred space that has the wonder-working relics of a saint that are venerated in multiple religious traditions. For example, I would think about the head of St. John the Baptist inside the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, or the relics of St. Basil of Ostrog that attract many Muslim pilgrims, and he grants them miracles, right, on a yearly basis. There are lots of studies about this kind of thing. But a shared space isn't always that. It can mean something else, because a space can be defined by multiple narratives, sometimes contradictory. Just look at the case of Hagia Sophia at the moment, with the current desire to turn it into a mosque. We know what Hagia Sophia is, and can it ever be anything different? Not to us, but there are multiple Ottoman narratives that describe the foundation of that building from a Muslim perspective. They argue that it was founded as a mosque from the very beginning, and it was either a shared space with the Christians of Byzantium, or it was simply on loan. And so the modern state of Turkey, a lot of these legends are still in circulation. They'd harken back to these, and perhaps they don't need to turn it into something that in their minds it already is, just as much as it is the great Church of Christ in our Orthodox understanding as well. So in that way, it's a shared sacred space through memory, even if that memory is one that's constructed with very little historical reality. So shared sacred space, it can be constructed, but it can be also a physical reality as well. And I would just like to say, just really briefly, that in this time of the global pandemic, when people are unable, in many cases, to visit the sacred spaces around them, the churches, the cathedrals, we are rethinking sacred space. Is our home a sacred space? We do a lot of things in our homes that we certainly wouldn't do in a church. But when we leave the church, we don't leave God in there either. And so we need to make sure that when we leave the church, we continue to act as Christians, because God follows us out of the church, so to speak, as well. And maybe our homes can become sacred spaces. They're certainly sanctified by the presence of icons and by the blessing of the home, and by our own prayer life as well. So this binary between sacred and profane is a lot more complicated, and sometimes I think that we'd prefer it to be a lot more clear cut. This is why I had a conversation with a Romanian priest earlier on this week. We mentioned the fact that a lot of icons, particularly on Cyprus, would have curtains on them, so that you wouldn't, if you were going to to do something that you'd be ashamed of, perhaps, you could draw the curtains first so that you wouldn't be defiling a sacred space or being gazed at from beyond.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. That's a fascinating reflection, Deacon, on the ways in which, a single space, like you were describing Hagia Sophia, can be shared by two groups with different narratives, or a single space can be shared in the sense that it's used for two different things, right? It's used both in the case of the home to live and carry out your domestic tasks and life, but also it can become sanctified and be a place of prayer and worship. So it's kind of two narratives or two functions, right? I mean, there are different ways of talking about the sharing of space
Yes,
across different strata, if you will.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes the sacred space isn't created by an ontological change, right? They can be temporary spaces that are sanctified by ritual performance, for example. I would think about a temporary chapel, for example, or our home altars. When we take the icons down, is the place forever changed? It's a difficult kind of question to answer. We run into this kind of thing when icons cease to be venerated in churches, but instead displayed in museums. The functionality of an object that sacralizes space in the correct context works in a very different way.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of analogous to the curtains on the icons,
I like the
but in a
curtains on
different.
the
No, and I mean, there's something very profound about that because, the icon is, of course, something that we see, but it does represent, in a sense, the truth that God also sees us and that we are seen, right? We are always
Yes.
seen. And for the most part, we are seen because God is the one, Theos, right, who sees. This is his main definition, if you will, in the etymology of the word for God in Greek, theoria, right, vision. And so that makes us the ones who are primarily being seen.
Yes,
and
and
by
that can be
icons,
painful.
Right.
If
Yeah.
we think about Adam and Eve, being seen was
Yes.
the unbearable thing.
Right. Well, I'm happy to jump in and speak a little bit about Saint Nikolai. His prayers by the lake are a beautiful collection. I'm sure both of you are familiar with them. They were I first encountered them when they were being read and studied in a book group in British Columbia, probably 10 years ago or so, by a priest who was himself a poet and a writer and able to appreciate the literary value that these prayers have. And that's the fine line that they tread, which I think is so beautiful, as does so much of the hymnography in the church, between theology and literature. They have a real aesthetic power to them and beauty in the language itself and the imagery that's used. But this is all done in order to convey truths which are otherwise inexpressible. And even in the hymns or even in the prayers that in this case Saint Nikolai himself wrote, God remains beyond those. And so in the presentation that you mentioned, Father Bratso, try and look at the way that these prayers call attention to their own limits, to the limits of creation and language in being able to express or convey something about God. And it's fascinating because in both Saint Nikolai's prayers by the lake and in certain passages of a 4th century work written by Saint Augustine called Confessions, the writer, both writers, Saint Nikolai, Saint Augustine, they're looking for God. They're in nature and they're addressing the creatures, the creations in nature, the plants, the animals, the sun, the moon, the stars, and they're asking, where is the Creator? Are you the Creator, right? How can we find Him? And the response of creation is, no, we are not Him, but He made us. And so we can say something about Him by how we were made and what we manifest. I think your language earlier, Deacon, about a sacred space being a place where there's a manifestation of God, or I think that's the language you used. Even in this case, for St. Nikolai, the natural world is a sacred space, or it can be, in revealing God. But there's also limits there, and it was fascinating to me that both writers were calling attention to those limits. That we're not worshippers. We're not. This is different than kind of maybe the old pagan theology, because we worship the Creator of these things. So this is what I was looking at in St. Nikolai's prayers by the lake. There's so much more to them. I think I just looked at maybe one or two of the prayers, and there are at least 100, I think, in this collection. And they're very beautiful.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Well, we should certainly read the writings, many writings of St. Nikolai Ojricha, St. Nikolai Velimirovich, and he indeed has left many writings. One of those was translated by Western American Diocese of the Serbian Orthodox Church, well-known prologue with daily lives of saints and daily reflections and homilies and so on. So highly recommend for everyone. And it's interesting, coincidentally, I will mention that those writings are actually available on app here that we have, also developed by Western American Diocese, and the app is called Orthoprox. So by clicking here, readers can access the lives of saints for the day, and depending on which version they would purchase, there is also audio. So one can hear the readings of saints.
He was born in Thessalonica. At first, he lived in asceticism near Thessalonica.
And of course, we have the prayers here as well. I'll move this way so that our readers can, viewers can see. And in addition to, of course, daily scriptural readings right here. So this is prologue, essentially with additional readings here, prologue of St. Nikolai Velimirovich. So thank you for sharing that as well. We live today in, we can say, the challenging times, at least for us living in the 21st century, in the midst of COVID-19. What would you suggest to young students? And this is July, our high school students have graduated in a very unusual way. I might add, my own daughter, Anastasia, graduated high school. Now she's heading to university, and her graduation was drive-through graduation, where she received her high school diploma. And now so many uncertainties whether she will be attending classes at university or perhaps at home. What would you, as Orthodox educators, suggest to young people, young students now continuing their education? What would you suggest to them in terms of what to really pay attention to, what to do, what not to do? Let's start with Deacon David.
Sure. I would say that this is a really good opportunity for them to think about whether they really want to go to university or not, and what the value of education is, and what they hope to achieve from it, rather than just going through the motions and doing what they feel like they have to do, tracing that piece of paper in order to tick another box and move on to the next thing. I think that if we can use this challenge, and I don't mean to minimize it at all by any means, but if we can try and use it as a gift in a way, a time of reflection. What's important in our lives? In many ways, it's just laid bare for us. We don't really have to do much work. So many things are taken away from us, so many distractions that we didn't realize that we were the victim of are taken away. So in a way, it's a liberation. When we think about, the command, pray without ceasing, it seems like an impossibility. We can certainly use this additional time for more prayer, and that would be the best way to, I think, approach this, not just coronavirus, but higher education. And are we really doing this in order to become better people and to become more Christ-like? Higher education can be that. It seems as if that's forgotten, that we should use these tools to craft ourselves, to make something
Yes.
of ourselves, and make ourselves in the image of saints, not just some kind of corporate success machine or something.
Well, that's quite amazing. Coincidentally, the Serbian word for education is obrazovanje, which actually means to put on the image, shape image.
Hmm.
The image, to
Wow.
shape
Very interesting.
image, for us, of course, image of Christ, becoming Christ-like, as you have mentioned. So obraz means image, and vinovati is to shape image within us. And that's ultimately goal for all of us as Orthodox Christians, is to become
Certainly.
Christ-like, as you said. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So, Reader Anthony, would you
Hmm.
share anything with us
Sure.
in terms of any
Yeah.
suggestions, any tips for students not going to college?
Yeah, it makes me think of a commonly practiced thing in many others in the world, which is called the gap year. This is a year where students, after graduating either high school or college, would deliberately take some time off. Maybe not a full year, maybe 6 months or so, but in some cases, a full year, and do their best to, in many cases, if possible, travel and learn and undertake the experience of an education through a sort of journey or putting yourself out in contexts where you're not as familiar. Of course, this would take a little bit of foresight and maybe saving up some funds, but you can always pick up odd jobs along the way. And if you have the opportunity to do something like this and it becomes possible, it can be a very powerful experience, because then you do, I think, reckon with yourself in a new way, and you come to reflect on your priorities, about who you are and what you really do feel called to do, what your God-given talents are. And there's a clarity that can emerge from a risky experience like this, an uncomfortable experience of travel or just sort of slowing down deliberately, maybe staying in the same place, but working and learning in the town where you already are, not jumping into something that perhaps you would otherwise do just because that's what all your friends are doing, or that's because that's something you used to want perhaps when you were younger. And this space for reflection and reckoning, I think, as the deacon was saying, can be very valuable, because college is very higher education is very important and can help you attain certain goals. But at the same time, you want to know as best you can what it is that you want to do. And thankfully, even if you do start college and get a degree in this or that, you can always go on and get a graduate degree in something different if you learn that, perhaps, this earlier subject wasn't for you. But that's one idea that I would suggest, is if it's possible to consider the idea of a gap year, a year in which you either save up and travel, even if just for a few months, to places that you've always wanted to go, or slow down deliberately in the place where you are, and really try and ask yourself some deep questions about where you want to be in 10 years or 20 years, and who you are in the sense of what God has given to you, how He has prepared you to be who you are, and what those talents and skills that you have. I know many people many students who simply start a degree in this or that because it's something that they think will get them into a high earning job. And in many cases, either that works out or it doesn't. But there's a shift later in life that happens because not enough consideration was given at an earlier point. That's one idea. The other idea I would say is try, while you're slowing down or while you're taking advantage of perhaps a pause in your life, don't get so distracted that you lose focus. I appreciate a word that you used a moment ago, Father Bratso. I think you said attention. Attention is really the key to education. And if we can learn to pay attention to what's in front of us, then we can actually learn to do anything. We can learn with enough time, with enough hours, we can learn anything. In fact, they say about 10,000 hours is what you need to gain mastery in any skill. And of course, the most important one being, for an Orthodox Christian, prayer. If we can practice attention in the moment and remain in the present and not get distracted by all the things that are trying to claim our attention, then we can learn to pray as well. This is something that I would often tell freshmen at the University of St. Catherine, that your attention is very expensive. There are many, many people who want your attention, advertisers or things on the internet, and they're doing everything they can to get your attention. But that's because your attention is valuable, and you should remember that and treat it that way, because what you give your time to shapes who you are. So what you give your time to, even though perhaps you don't think that you should be defined by how many TV shows you watch or how much social media you're on, that does actually shape you. And at this time when we do rely so much on digital technology for good things, like a podcast like this, it's also easy to get distracted. So I would say, remember that your attention is a valuable thing, and use it as wisely as you can.
Yes, thank you. Excellent point. Now we're coming to an end of our program, and I'd like to thank each of you for your participation and contribution to our conversation and ongoing dialogue, praying and calling God's blessings upon you, your work, and your families. And before we end, would you have anything else to share at this point? A sentence or two. Deacon David?
I think that we often think about the Holy Mountain, for example, as an ideal, as a place that we want to visit because it is cut off from the world. Now we are in many ways cut off from the world ourselves. But because we are cut off from the world not by our own free agency, but by chaos, we hate it. But let's think about that, and let's behave always with our attention first on prayer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It's beautiful said. Reader Anthony?
Yes, I would echo that. That was beautifully said, Deacon. I think, while we are in this time of uncertainty and, struggle, confusion about the future, we should remember, I think, two things. One is that, in fact, we have never been in control. It sometimes is tempting to think that we have control over our lives, but times like this show us that we don't, and this is a humbling thing. This is something that we can learn from. It's easier said than done, but it is an opportunity that we are being given to, as the deacon said, to use the sort of exile from the world, which Elder Emilianos of Simona Petra said is the beginning of the spiritual life. To use this involuntary exile in a way for spiritual benefit and caring for others. The second thing is just never to lose hope. Never to lose hope. Our Lord has sustained His church and His people throughout the centuries, and there were many darker times than this. So there's much reason to hope. So that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. One thing is for certain, that Christ is risen and He has overcome the
Amen.
world, and the church has prevailed everything over the centuries and will continue to do so. So let us seek our answers within the church. Beautiful. And it was such a great honor for me to talk to you today. Look forward to seeing you again, perhaps at one of the future video podcasts of Western American Diocese of the Serbian Orthodox Church, or perhaps here at one of our Orthodox parishes in San Diego area, where our clergy are quite active, and we truly come together quite often, serving and just meet together as Orthodox brothers and sisters. Thank you again, and God bless you and
Thank you.
your families.
Thank you,
Thank
Father.
you.